Joining me now is global risk analyst John Sidelides. John, good to see you.
Good to be with you, Liz.
All right, John, let's just dive right into this. This handbook, this manual, the Lithuanian government gave to their people. Is this a valid fear that Russia will at some point invade their nation?
It's a very valid fear on the part of the Lithuanian government and the Lithuanian people. It's actually the third such manual that they've issued since December of last year. And I think they're very much concerned that as the Russians used a policy of denial and ambiguity to move into Crimea 2 years ago and to move into Ukraine shortly afterwards, that they might use a similar policy, which is not an outright hostile act or an act of military provocation, but very sneakily, very stealthily try to disrupt Lithuanian society and look to see if they can push the envelope and test NATO resolve, European resolve, and American resolve to set clear lines to defend NATO allies, and if they can't, to threaten disrupting the NATO alliance.
Right, and I mean, that's exactly what the nation of Lithuania said. They cited Ukraine as an indication that Russia is willing to invade, to push that boundary. And I think they do have reason to, at least from the American point of view, doubt Obama's strength here in response. But the Lithuanians, their response to this threat is that it won't be as easy for you here as it has been other places. We are going to fight back.
It's the wise policy of any government that fears some type of invasion or military offensive from a neighbor, and that is to make very clear that resistance is going to be in place, and we're going to make this as difficult for you as possible. I don't know how much of this, Liz, is purely psychological, because most people really believe that Russia is not looking to actually engage in an outright military action against a NATO ally. And remember, Lithuania and its two Baltic neighbors, Latvia and Estonia, all three of those were former Soviet territories, and they're all three now in the NATO alliance. So the United States and the rest of Europe, or at least the NATO members, are legally obligated to come to Lithuania's defense in the event of an external attack by Russia. So the question is, what kind of movement will the Russian government potentially undertake? Will it be one that is an overt attack that automatically triggers a NATO response, or more, I would say, cunningly, the kind of action that isn't overt, but really pushes NATO to respond in some forceful way, or sending a message to a number of Eastern European allies that this brinksmanship is one that the U.S. cannot compete with, we will not support our allies, and then leading to the eventual fraying of the NATO alliance, which may very well be Vladimir Putin's objective here.
Right, and we've seen this, not to get off the topic here, but we've seen this same sort of pressure, albeit for a different purpose. We've seen this unwillingness almost of NATO allies to come to the aid of other NATO nations when there's been these terror attacks across Europe, and these have been attacks on NATO allies, and they haven't invoked Article 5. So it is an interesting question that Russia brings up, although certainly not the media or the medium through which they should be doing this. But in my opinion, John, this is a symptom of Obama's weakness this past 8 years. Like I said in the intro, he's constantly apologizing. He's bowing to foreign leaders. He's not taking a lead on any of these major things in the world, and it's allowing these other larger countries, aspiring superpowers, I call them, to position themselves to be actual superpowers. Even look at what China's doing in Africa.
Well, you make a very good point about the administration's lack of responses in Europe, Liz, in that whoever wins the presidency in several days, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, they will be inheriting a basket of such terrible foreign policy options to have to deal with, starting with Crimea, moving to Ukraine, and in the Baltics, where the Lithuanians are terrified of an invasion. The Russians are very deliberately undertaking a number of military measures to effectively convert the Baltic Sea into a Russian lake, and then they have installed both anti-missile systems into a chunk of Russian sovereign territory sandwiched between Poland and the Baltics, called Kaliningrad. If they were to activate that anti-missile system, Liz, it would basically mean a 350-mile radius of a Russian-controlled no-fly zone in the middle of the NATO alliance. And what does a President Clinton or a President Trump do? How do they respond when, in effect, they are not allowed to send U.S. planes or helicopters across 2/3 of Poland or anywhere in the Baltic countries? That's not an alliance anymore. And the Russians have very candidly put themselves in a position of great leverage now, and there's been no U.S. response.
Right, and
So
and
we
that,
see a
that
number
ties
of
it
problems
back.
that are going to be passed on to the next administration.
Right, and then that ties it back to what you were just saying before, that Russia is trying to push the boundaries to see exactly how far they can go, because ultimately they don't want to be up against the force of a cohesive NATO alliance. But if it's not cohesive, then it's not as difficult for them. John, I always appreciate your insight on these issues. Thank you so much for being on the show. Our next tipping point with Scott Greer is the 3,800 refugees who have died so far this year crossing the Mediterranean Sea. We'll be right back.